Buenas tardes a todos y a todas y muchísimas gracias por estar aquí en este evento tan especial del Festival ISLA, Cicatrices, Pasado y Presente. Muchísimas gracias al Instituto Cervantes Dublín por haberlo organizado también y tenemos el honor y el gran privilegio de contar con 3 autoras de renombre en el panorama literario contemporáneo. Reyna Grande, de Estados Unidos y México, y Audrey Magee, de Irlanda, y María José Caro, de Perú. Así que muchas gracias a vosotras por estar aquí también. Como bien sabemos, este es un evento bilingüe y creo que presentaré a Reyna Grande y María José Caro en español, ¿sí? Y hablaremos en español. And then I will present Audrey Magee in English, and we will talk in English. Primero, Reyna Grande, que es una autora reconocida de México y Estados Unidos, es autora de las novelas A través de 100 montañas y Bailando con las mariposas, y su novela más reciente, Corrido de Amor y Gloria, cuenta la historia del Batallón de San Patricio, un grupo de soldados irlandeses que desertaron del ejército estadounidense para unirse al ejército mexicano durante la invasión de México entre 1846 y 1848, ¿verdad? Y la novela combina la épica histórica con una intensa historia de amor. Y os lo recomiendo, de verdad. Reyna también es autora de, entre otras publicaciones, Las Memorias, La búsqueda de un sueño, que es un libro reconocido por Kirkus Reviews como uno de los libros mejor escritos del siglo XXI. Y también de La distancia entre nosotros, donde narra su infancia como niña migrante indocumentada en Estados Unidos. Estudió escritura creativa y cine en la Universidad de California, Santa Cruz, y luego obtuvo un máster en escritura creativa de la Universidad de Antioch, ¿verdad? Actualmente enseña en Antioch University y Randolph College, ¿verdad? Galardonada con el American Book Award y el premio Aztlán y finalista del National Book Critics Circle Award, recibió el premio Colibrí en las artes literarias en 2024. Y luego María José Caro, que es de Lima, Perú, y obtuvo un máster en comunicación de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Es autora de las novelas Perro de ojos negros y Vida animal, así como de los libros de cuentos ¿Qué tengo de malo? Y La primaria, entre otras. Su obra ha sido publicada en muchos países: Perú, México, Chile, Argentina, España y Colombia. Ha participado en diversas antologías de ficción nacionales e internacionales, y en 2017 el Hay Festival la seleccionó dentro de la iniciativa Bogotá 39, que reúne a los mejores escritores jóvenes de América Latina. Vida animal explora los lazos de la amistad, la infancia y la memoria, con todas sus tensiones y intimidades. Cuenta la historia de 4 amigas de infancia, quienes se reencuentran en una casa de campo para la despedida de soltera de una de ellas. And now for Audrey Magee, who is an Irish novelist and journalist. She received her degree in German and French at UCD and a master's in journalism in DCU. And you worked as a journalist for 12 years, is that right? Yeah. And her debut novel, The Undertaking, which was published in 2014, was nominated for the Bailey's Women Prize for Fiction, France's Prix du Premier Roman, and the Irish Book Awards. Her acclaimed second novel, The Colony, was published in 2022 and longlisted for the Booker Prize, explores colonialism, identity, and language in a masterful prose with humour and depth. Through this sharp prose and layered structure, The Colony examines how colonialism shapes language and belonging, and how those histories echo through art and story. Audrey is the 2023 recipient of the Inwards Literary Award, and both of her novels are being adapted into film and have been translated into more than 20 languages. Bueno, juntas, las obras de estas tres autoras nos recuerdan cómo la literatura es capaz de capturar tanto las cicatrices visibles e invisibles de la historia, de las relaciones y de las comunidades y las naciones. Nuestra conversación hoy recorrerá continentes y historias distintas, pero girará en torno a un tema común: cicatrices. Pero cómo los relatos enfrentan los legados del pasado y los transforman en arte. Primero me gustaría empezar con unas preguntas generales para vosotras tres, intentando encontrar estos vínculos y temas que tenéis en común. Cada una de vuestras novelas aborda algún tipo de cicatriz histórica o personal. ¿Cómo os acercáis a la escritura de la memoria y las huellas que deja? ¿Veis la literatura como una forma de sanar o más bien de preservar y hacer frente a las cicatrices? No sé si alguien quiere empezar. ¿Sí?
Hola. Hola, antes que nada quisiera agradecer a tanto al Instituto Cervantes como a la Embajada del Perú por invitarme a participar de este festival. Es muy bonito para mí estar aquí, teniendo en cuenta que para un autor estar en Dublín es como llevar a un niño a Disneylandia o algo así, por todo el legado literario que trae consigo. Así que me voy a llevar muchísimos libros en la maleta, cosa que no, que no había pensado con antelación. Bueno, para mí la literatura me da muchas cosas. Primero, es un espacio que me permite transitar la vida de una manera más feliz. Un día en el que escribo, para mí es un día en el que me siento mejor y en el que puedo afrontar los problemas ordinarios del trabajo, domésticos y tal, de una mejor manera. Escribir también creo que es una forma, o solamente mediante la escritura hay ciertas cosas que se llegan a pensar. Cuando uno se enfrenta a un texto, pues lo encamina de determinada forma y luego esto va cambiando en función al propio proceso de escritura, que ya de por sí a mí me genera muchísimo interés también, porque es un proceso consciente que a la vez no es consciente, ¿no? Porque hay una suerte de voz que te está dictando aquello que quieres decir, ¿no? Digamos, que es el yo que escribe o el yo autor, ¿no? Y también es una herramienta para preservar aquello que se nos va, ¿no? Entonces, en mi caso, en la novela Vida Animal, lo que yo quería preservar era la adolescencia de un grupo de amigas, millennials viejas, ¿no? Hemos sido adolescentes a inicios de los 2000 y quería pues encapsular mediante la literatura ese tiempo y cómo se vivía en Lima, en ciertos grupos en ese momento.
Pues muchas gracias. Buenas noches a todos y primeramente pues sí, también quiero darle las gracias a Tomás Olvera López y a la Embajada de México por invitarme. Pues bueno, para mí la escritura lo hago por diferentes razones. Primero, cuando empecé a escribir a los 13 años era como una manera de terapia, porque yo estaba sufriendo mucho del trauma de ser inmigrante en Estados Unidos. Yo crucé la frontera de México y Estados Unidos a los 9 años, cuando mi padre me llevó a vivir a California y contrató un coyote para que nos cruzara la frontera. Y a los 9 años llegué a los Estados Unidos a sufrir del estigma, ¿no? De ser indocumentada, de vivir en una sociedad donde nos rechazan mucho allá, los mexicanos, los latinos, y de hacerme sentirme avergonzada, ¿no? De ser mexicana, de hablar español, bueno, todo eso. Entonces a los 13 años yo empecé a escribir en mi diario como algo personal, no era para desahogarme a través de la escritura. pero fue cuando ya estaba más grande, a los 19 años, que una maestra me motivó para que estudiara la escritura creativa y empecé a escribir porque quería yo serme escritora profesional, y lo hice porque para mí la escritura se convirtió en un acto de rebeldía, porque de tantos años, ¿no?, que la sociedad americana me hiciera sentir avergonzada de ser mexicana, de ser inmigrante, de ser hispanohablante, llegué a un punto en que dije, bueno, pues ser inmigrante no es algo de que avergonzarme, eso es mi superpoder. Y empecé a escribir sobre mi experiencia para revelarme y decir, no, de esto no me avergüenzo. Voy a hacer lo opuesto, voy a empezar a escribir sobre estas experiencias para celebrar la vida que me ha tocado vivir y estas experiencias que me han tocado experimentar. Después de publicar algunos de mis primeros libros, me di cuenta que la escritura también es activismo. Yo puedo ser una activista a través de la literatura porque a través de mis libros he podido darle voz a una comunidad marginada, como la comunidad inmigrante en Estados Unidos, que muchas veces no se nos escucha, ¿no?, nuestra voz, a nuestra presencia, y yo quise darle voz a mi comunidad, especialmente a los niños inmigrantes, que muchas veces no se nos incluye en las conversaciones de inmigración. Y bueno, entonces he decidido que la literatura tiene mucho poder y a través de la literatura puedo yo alzar la voz por mi comunidad y celebrar nuestras historias, y también un acto de empoderamiento y decir, aquí estamos y no nos vamos.
Do I do this? Yeah. Okay. Buenas tardes. Noches. I don't know which. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation from the Instituto Cervantes, and welcome. You talk about it being a Disneyland for children. I can tell you, as somebody who wants to, when she's a child or a teenager, thinks of being a writer in Ireland, in the Dublin area, it is the most intimidating space to think, oh, I'd like to be a writer. It's like, Joyce, Beckett, all these weights on your shoulder. How dare you even put yourself in this frame? So I'm glad it's Disneyland for you. It was something of a torture chamber for me, but I did it anyway. Defiance, it's required. I'm really interested in this concept of scars, scarring, because as we see in the world today, we seem insistent on continuously creating scars. And for me, those scars were scars of silence, and that hugely inform my work, but also scars of language. If I just talk a little bit about silence, I grew up here in this area, so safe. None of the traumas or the troubles or the interpretation that you would have gone through, except when it came to the troubles of Northern Ireland, the euphemistically called troubles. And I grew up here in the South, very safe, but also very determined by this violence and this interpretation of language, the Irish flag, and violence being done in the name of Ireland, that it was, as a teenager, people are dying, and they're dying for your flag, and they're dying for your national language, and they're dying theoretically then by extrapolation for you, for me. And, we all found a way to deal with this, but most of it was in silence. And most of it was finding a kind of our own relationship with the language. And for many people with the Irish language, that is, and for many people of my generation, that was to kind of eschew the language, to kind of focus on other things. In my case, French, German, Latin, languages that were not Irish, because Irish was so politicized, it was so wrapped up in politics that you were scarred by that concept of your relationship with the national language. So these scars run very deep, and they are very quiet scars, but they're damaging. And they are the perfect place for literature, because literature gives you the time and the space to explore, to unpick, to kind of work down into these silences, and to work down into the relationship between ordinary people and violence between ordinary people, and this big frame of the legacy of colonization, the scar of colonization. So, yeah, scars, I think, are fundamental to what writers deal with, actually, a lot of the time, to cheer us up, keep us off the streets. So, yeah.
Muchas gracias. Thank you, Margaret. Gracias por estas respuestas tan interesantes. Ahora que hablas de las cicatrices del lenguaje, es muy interesante pensar en esto en cuanto a, bueno, tu libro, pero también tu libro sobre el corrido de amor y gloria. Los dos libros tienen mucho en común, de hecho, porque los dos libros utilizan un poquito de irlandés en los libros, y hablan del colonialismo también, y el lenguaje en general. María José, tú también hablas del lenguaje. De hecho, el prólogo de tu libro, que es una cita de Jonathan Safran Foer, las palabras nunca dicen lo que queremos decir con ellas. Entonces, el lenguaje, como bien dices, Audrey, lleva sus cicatrices también de poder, de pérdida, de herencia, ¿verdad? ¿Cómo pensáis el lenguaje en vuestras obras? ¿Como herramienta, campo de batalla o refugio? Quizás Reyna, si te apetece.
Okay, I think I'm going to do this one in English.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, language it's kind of complicated for me, because when I have a lot of language trauma. When I arrived in the United States, I was immediately put into an English-only classroom when I didn't speak a word of English. And my teacher immediately made me feel ashamed for speaking Spanish. And I arrived in California, that it has, I mean, the population in California is majority Latino, and, a lot of Spanish speakers there. But at the time, bilingual education was being dismantled, and California voters had actually voted to make English the official state language. And so there was a lot of discrimination against Spanish speakers. And in the schools, we didn't have a lot of bilingual programs. So immediately upon arriving, I was made to feel that I had to speak English, and my Spanish was not wanted in my school and outside of school as well. And so I started to lose my Spanish. And it took me a long time to learn the term of what happened to me. It's called subtractive bilingualism, where you're not adding another language and becoming bilingual by adding a language. You're actually replacing your mother tongue with a new language. And so that's what happened to me. And it took me a long time to start to overcome that shame of being a Spanish speaker and start to reclaim my Spanish. And when I was at the university, I discovered that the Spanish program had a class called Spanish for Spanish Speakers. And it was specifically tailored for kids like me that had lost their native tongue. That we spoke Spanish, but spoken Spanish, but we hadn't really received a formal education in Spanish. And so when I started taking Spanish for Spanish speakers classes, my teacher was just so supportive, constantly telling us, there's nothing wrong with how you speak Spanish. There's no such thing as broken Spanish. You speak how you speak and be proud of it. And through very, very positive classroom, environments, I was able to then start relearning my mother tongue. And to this day, I'm still trying to learn it. One of the questions I get asked a lot is if I write my books in Spanish. And every time I say, no, I write them in English, there's a certain shame that comes up because I wish I could say I write them in Spanish. But I do try to translate my own work, or I work very closely with the translator. And that's my way of reclaiming my mother tongue, stitching it back on and just really embracing being bilingual and not being ashamed, of when I go to Mexico and they tell me you speak like a gringa, or, and then in the US, when I speak English, I speak like a Mexican. And it's like, well, because I'm both. Both countries, both cultures have made me who I am. And I am going to just celebrate how I speak. And I love being able to communicate in both languages wherever I go. And to me, that's the beauty of being bilingual, of being able to understand that, through the years, these are the two cultures that have formed my identity, not just as a woman, but as a writer as well. And so I'm trying to heal, we're talking about scars. I'm trying to heal my wound of my mother tongue and the loss of my mother tongue by stitching it back on and reclaiming it and celebrating it.
Sí. Bueno, en cuanto a mi relación con el lenguaje, yo siempre lo veo de una forma, ¿no? Y es que el lenguaje, el hecho de hablar, es lo más ordinario, o sea, las palabras son lo más ordinario y lo más transaccional que hay, ¿no? Las utilizamos diariamente para cualquier cosa. Sin embargo, cuando se vuelve en literatura, cambia totalmente la connotación de ella, ¿no? Entonces, ahora justo que me llevaba un poemario de Yeats y dices, ¿cómo algo tan transaccional puede ser a la vez tan hermoso? Entonces, yo cuando era chica, siempre fui muy torpe y siempre fui muy tímida. Y me di cuenta de que siento que soy una mejor persona cuando escribo. Porque cuando uno escribe no tiene que enfrentarse al otro, o se enfrenta al otro a destiempo. Y cuando se enfrenta al otro a destiempo, ya la manera de comunicarse es totalmente distinta, ¿no? Entonces, justamente ahora que comentas la cita que coloqué en la novela, tiene que ver justamente con eso, ¿no? Con que muchas veces en nuestro afán de querer generar un vínculo con otro, se pierden muchas cosas que no tienen que ver necesariamente con lo que queremos decir, sino con cómo se comprenden, ¿no? Por N factores que tienen que ver con el contexto, la coyuntura, la timidez, la personalidad, etc. Y para mí, mi relación con la escritura es algo fundamental en mi vida. Yo, de hecho, soy muy obsesiva al escribir. Escribo casi todos los días y leo lo que escribo antes de poder seguir una siguiente página, ¿no? Es un proceso que me tiene que sonar a música, ¿no? Cuando siento que ya pasa la prueba de haber sido leído en voz alta, digo, bueno, pues con esto ya puedo avanzar, ¿no? Y además hay una analogía que a mí me gusta mucho, que una vez leí en un texto donde te dicen, bueno, en la vida uno es como que yo habito en una casa, ¿no? Y en esta casa está yo, María José, que trabaja, que tiene un hijo, que va al trabajo, que hace las compras, que se encarga de que él se esté lavando la ropa y qué sé yo. Y ese es un yo como el yo general. Y detrás de esa casa hay un bosque y es un bosque donde es invierno y está nevando. Y al fondo del bosque hay una pequeña cabaña. Y en esa cabaña está el yo que escribe. Entonces es una lucha constante, la de el yo ordinario que tiene que transitar todo ese jardín, ver qué botas se pone, qué hachas lleva para llegar a ese punto donde está la cabaña y ser el yo que escribe. Entonces, para mí es una relación casi mágica, ¿no? Entonces, y siento que uno tiene que estar en un mood específico, que es el propio narrador el que construye, ¿no? En mi caso puede ser escuchar música instrumental, sentir que soy totalmente imbuida en algo, ¿no? Pero creo que tiene que ser una relación, o en mi caso es una relación así de personal, ¿no? Y eso.
Muchas gracias. Perdona.
So when I was in secondary school, I don't know how many of you are of my generation, but who would have been compelled to study PEG, which is the rather kind of pared back, I'm sure Beckett read her, story of a woman living on the Blasket Islands. And this was part of our curriculum in the Irish language, as we studied Irish language at school. And everybody hated PEG except me. I loved PEG. But I couldn't dare say that I loved PEG, because if I said I loved PEG, I was dead meat, because there was not a cool thing to do in school if you wanted to stay alive. So there was this kind of hinterland of secrecy in the 1980s for me about this kind of relationship with the Irish language, because I grew up in this area. I mean, I grew up within the Pale. There was no Irish spoken. And it kind of wasn't, it was just very much thinking of Joyce here in the city in the, when he was a student, and he said that he wanted, as part of this whole kind of nationalist movement, he was going to learn the Irish language. And he went off to lessons just up the road here. And, went kind of quite diligently, as he did if he got interested in something. But then just like, oh, to hell with this, because he hated the nationalism. He hated the kind of fervour around kind of the politics of the Irish language. And he said, forget this, I'm out of here. English is the language of the continent. I'm gone, And for my generation, we still lived with that kind of binary concept of, you had to kind of choose, because if you chose Irish, you were saying a lot about yourself. So, I've met people of my generation who actually came from this area too, but went on to become professors of Irish. And I said, well, how did you do that? And one particular woman, she said, I was just a rebel. I rebelled by taking up the language, and everybody else was going in the opposite direction. And it was this that really stuck with me for this novel, for The Colony, because it's like kind of, we know what happened. Like we all say, oh yeah, we know colonization, we know what happened to the language. But actually, do we truly kind of understand what happened? Do we really truly understand how it happened? So using the novel, I created this frame of bringing the whole thing of colonization and the Irish language and the violence onto this really tiny imagined island off the west coast of Ireland. Because I wanted to explore these scars, I wanted to explore these legacies of attitude to language that we inherit, but that we also absorb ourselves. So we have a certain level of responsibility for that. And to do this, I brought onto this island it was an Irish-speaking island in the novel. And onto this Irish-speaking island, I brought an English artist who wanted to kind of rebuild his career as a great artist back in London. But then following him came a French linguist. And he was tracing the language, the demise of the Irish language over 5 years for his PhD studies back in Paris. And it's a summer of conflict between these two men in 1979, basically about who is the better colonizer, who knows the way to colonize, you know? Am I the better colonizer? Am I the kind of one holding this French legacy because I'm going to protect the Irish language? Or is it the Englishman who's saying, no, English is the language of the future. Let everybody learn English. It's how they'll get jobs. It's how they'll buy bread. It's how they'll have access to the international world. Nobody speaks Irish. You know, nobody needs Irish. So it's this kind of debate that goes on in the book that really started with Peg when I realized I was on the wrong side, but probably wasn't brave enough to take up the Irish side. So yeah, I'm still kind of dealing with this because it is an inherited space, and many scars and many traumas are inherited. You know, and we carry them with us without quite understanding where these scars came from. And novels, writing, words, going to your shed at the back of the garden. These are great ways of delving in to find out the causes of these scars and traumas and why we have this relationship that we have with language.
I thank you all for your answers. I do find it very, very interesting in the colony how the Sassenach, this Englishman who comes over, he thinks he has the island basically, well, not to himself, but that he's the only outsider coming onto the island. And then suddenly there's this, what seems to be this Frenchman, Jean-Pierre Masson, who later we find actually his mother was Algerian. And, you know, that he's quite a nuanced character who has maybe other reasons as well for wanting to preserve the Irish language. And then, of course, his constant reminding of one of the characters, Mairead's son, James. Every time James comes in, he calls him Seamus, the Irish for James. And I thought that was interesting in terms of who has the right to, control somebody else's language or how somebody else uses their language.
And I think this is language's problem. You know, it ends up politicized. It ends up being a method of control or influence. And you know what? It's a language. It's a means of communication, but it's a means of carrying heritage, about carrying knowledge. Particularly, I don't know about your languages, but in the Irish language, about landscape and about place, like it's so embedded in the Irish language. So our, that kind of tradition of, you ask somebody in Ireland, it's not Google Maps has destroyed everything, but, go down, turn left at the church, right at the pub, and then right at the other pub, left at that pub. It was all done conventionally, traditionally through landmarks, but that's actually in the language. So, unfortunately, language gets caught in being kind of a talisman for how great we are at being Irish, whether it's nationalism, republicanism, whatever ism there is. This poor little language gets kicked around. And that's not just here. That happens, across the world. And, I come to language as a linguist. I come to language as somebody who is very passionate about language and its way of forming a means of communication, but also of carrying knowledge, legacy, attitude. And that can get lost. And that's where, when you talk about Seamus or James, how much right do you have to your choice in language, or how much one of James's, he's a 15-year-old boy who's lost his father, his uncle, and his grandfather in a single fishing accident. So all the burden of holding his family together is on him. And he's burdened with all these responsibilities, and he wants to escape and become an artist, as he's discovered he has a natural capacity. But one of the things he's really resisting too is being given to the burden of looking after the great-grandmother, the grandmother, the mother, and now the mother tongue. And the 15-year-old is just being overwhelmed by all this responsibility, because language, when it's not used, and it is that legacy and it carries who we are, can be a burden. That's why Man Call Mangan, to lose him is such a sadness for us all, because his passion was the language and the relationship between language and the landscape and who we are, you know. So yeah, he's an extraordinary loss to language here.
Great loss. I also just wanted to continue a little bit on the colony momentarily, because I found how you dealt with this theme of the Troubles as a kind of colonialism in Ireland is, you know, for centuries that's gone on, but it's all dealt with on the microcosm of this small island. But then there are these kind of journalistic snippets that are brought in like between a few chapters about what's going on up north with the Troubles. And, you know, a Catholic from such a community has been shot, or a Protestant from here has been killed. And that constant reminder throughout the book, I thought, was done so interestingly from a very journalistic perspective, and contrasts with this beautiful poetic-like prose that's also very funny. I found myself laughing out loud with the irony of this colonial gaze of the Sassenach, the English artist in particular. I found that it was done very, very beautifully and very subtly, and with in a way that dealing with something that's still very, I think, painful for Irish people to deal with in lots of ways. But there was no sense of any directing people to think in a particular way. It was just opened up to encourage the reader to ask questions, I think, rather than to be guided in terms of how to, you know, instead of giving answers to such a huge, delicate topic.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to Henry VIII, you know. We all think, it's back to what I said earlier, we all think we understand colonization, that's over, it's all. But, you know, as part of colonization and as part of the control mechanism colonization, we were divided into Protestant and Catholic. We live still with that legacy. We just don't always understand where that legacy or that scar or that, you know, that trauma comes from. But, you know, it's kind of like what was done in Rwanda, you know, the Hutus and the Tutsis, and you get the power, no, you get the power, no, I'm giving control to you, no. You know, this kind of this godlike creation of a structure. And, you know, what does that do to people? How do you come back from such an old division that, you know, where if you joined that side, you accrued benefits, and if you were part of that other side, well, you had loss and humiliation about your language, about your poverty, about how you lived. So, you know, that legacy of colonization was living in that violence in Northern Ireland. So that was, you know, you can go back to Henry VIII dividing us into Protestant and Catholic, and that still being fought out in Northern Ireland because it was along the same lines. So this is not a Northern novel. I do not at all, you know, expect or claim or anything like this. This is very much a Southern perspective, and that's the distance. So that's why they're like bulletins. They're written as bulletins that cut into the narrative. So the narrative is written, the narrative of the island is written in the past tense, but then there are these bulletins cutting into the story just as they happened over that summer of 1979, but they're written in the present tense because they are still with us. Those are the prevalent scar of this period of colonization and this division into Protestant and Catholic. So why do I not draw any? Because we've had enough people telling us what to think, how to speak, what to speak. Yeah, you don't need me, you know. So what we need is to create a space where we can consider, we can reflect, we can explore. Because, I want to understand it. And do I understand it? No. I spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland as a journalist. Some of the days very difficult. The Oma bomb, very difficult. Like, you can't just walk away. You can't see all that stuff and just walk away. But yet, everybody, for the price of peace, is supposed to walk away. But I think that's the problem, is that the scars are very deep. And people are supposed to cover over the scars, but there are holes under the scars. And if you push too much under the skin, you'll find that that's quite a deep scar under there. And there's only a veneer of skin over that scar. And, writers, you talk about a capacity to explore things for your community. I mean, I think that's just, we don't have a job of that, but it's probably what we tend to do, is just to try and find a space to look at things a little differently. Because there is the accepted narrative, but actually, what is that narrative? So,
yeah, it's also so fascinating. And I think there's quite a few links there, Reyna, with your novel. The Ballad of Love and Glory, or Corrido de Amor y Gloria, particularly in terms of, the colonization and, of course, this very specific these Irish soldiers who ended up deserting the American side and going over to the Mexican side. And you go into this character, John Riley, in a very, very interesting way, and his, the whole regiment of the Irish soldiers, and sometimes with the Irish that they use comes in as well. And after the famine, they're over there. You explore very well the history of how and the reasons why these Irish people ended up fighting on the Mexican side with Mexicans and other nationalities as well. So I thought that was really, really so fascinating, the way it was done. Calling it a corrido, or a ballad, I think is also very interesting. Of course, that comes from the Mexican corrido, no? And the structure of it as well is quite interesting from that perspective. Thinking about your book and the Irish influence there, where did that stem from?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about, we're talking about scars, and I thought about the U.S.-Mexico border, that there is no scar, there's a wound, because it just won't heal, right? And we keep seeing, since the 19th century, this area between Mexico and the United States has been a place of a lot of hurt and violence, and it continues to this day. So there really is, it hasn't been allowed to scar because it continues to bleed, and it is a wound that doesn't heal. I am really fascinated by the history of the U.S.-Mexico border, because as somebody who crossed that border as a child, I wanted to understand how does my immigrant story fit into the larger story of the border. And so I was reading about the history, about the U.S. invasion of Mexico, and I was really fascinated to discover that the Irish played a role in that creation of the U.S.-Mexico border. And not a lot of people know about it, and I certainly didn't know about it. When I discovered the St. Patrick's Battalion, I started to, my first question was why, right? Like, why would these Irishmen desert the U.S. Army and switch sides? And desertion was punishable by death. And so the question was like, why would they risk their own lives to help Mexico defend itself against U.S. invaders? So I started to write this book. It took me 7 years to research and to write the book. And I understood why. the first thing I understood was unlearning Irish history is that, of course, these Irishmen had a lot of sympathy for Mexico because Ireland had suffered from the oppression of, the British Empire. They had been invaded, so they knew firsthand what it was like, the trauma of an invasion. The Irish people had been dispossessed of their lands and of their language, and all these things that they had gone through. That helped them to see that something like that could happen to Mexico, because Mexico was under the threat of empire, of the U.S. empire, and they felt that Mexico could be turned into another Ireland. And then, of course, there was the connection with religion. Mexico is a Catholic country. And so the Irish felt very strongly, at least these Irishmen that deserted, they felt very strongly that they could not participate in an unjust invasion and also attacking a Catholic nation. So there were some things that really helped me to understand and admire these Irish heroes of Mexico, right? That's what they're called in Mexico, los héroes irlandeses de México. And for me, it was really important to write about this time period because in the United States, the U.S. invasion is as if it never happened. It has been erased from U.S. history. Children don't grow up learning about this invasion, and they don't know. A lot of people in the United States have no idea that the states of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Texas, parts of Colorado, parts of Utah, parts of Wyoming were once Mexican lands. And because they don't know that, they buy into this very, very false belief that all Mexicans are immigrants, right? They don't understand that in the Mexican-American community, there's so many Mexican families who didn't cross the border crossed them. And they can trace their families back through generations, that they are natives. And in the U.S. Mythology, we Mexicans are the invaders. And that's how we are seen. And that's why today, we are seeing so much violence that is been, that our Mexican community and the Latino community is being subjected to, right? Because of this erasure in our history and because of this wound. And so for me, it was really important to try to write about this because not only has the United States tried to erase this part of history, but in Mexico too, like nowadays, like we were talking with Tomas earlier, they don't teach about this time period as much anymore. Like children in Mexico are not really learning the history. So many young people there don't even know anymore about the land theft that occurred in the 1840s. They don't know about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, all these things. And I think part of it is because it hurts. It still hurts too much to even think about that. And so there's a part where, things that hurt, sometimes it's better to forget so that we don't continue reliving that pain. But I think for me, it's important to remember that because we have to learn from our history in order for us to stop making the same mistakes, but also in order for us to be more empowered. And if we know our history, we can be empowered and we can push back against the injustices that we're seeing now. And also, I want everybody to know about the St. Patrick's Battalion because they're the perfect example of what to do when you see an injustice, that you stand up for what is right, even if the price you pay is very high, but you still have to do what is right.
Muy interesante, sí, muy importante también. I think that you mentioned about the kind of social activism of writing. And I think what you're saying there really clarifies that, so crystallizes it so well in relation to your book and your writing and your way of being in the world as well, maybe. Yeah. And María José, las cicatrices que aparecen en tu libro son muy interesantes también, porque estas cicatrices, claro, hay un vínculo porque Daniela, ella viaja a España, a Valencia, y vuelve allí. Estoy pensando en los vínculos que aparecen en los libros. Daniela es un personaje no principal, pero forma parte de este grupo de amigas. Vive en España en su adultez y vuelve a Perú, pero con palabras distintas y maneras de decir las cosas de otra forma y tal. Pero las cicatrices que aparecen en tu libro, realmente yo creo que más que nada son cicatrices que tienen que ver con el sentido de pertenencia, ¿no? O de la identidad y del paso del tiempo. Porque estas amigas realmente tienen una idea de cómo son, pero luego se crecen y se enganchan a esta idea de la esencia de la persona, ¿no?
Sí, bueno, la novela lo que busca es reflexionar acerca de la amistad, ¿no? Entonces, vemos este grupo de amigas que son adultas, que se han reunido después de mucho tiempo, y como nos suele pasar a muchos, que hemos hecho amigos durante la infancia, y ya en los 30 y tantos no tenemos nada en común con ellos. Lo único que tenemos en común con ellos es que juntos podemos reconstruir un momento que hemos vivido en el pasado. Entonces, estas amigas de la novela se la pasan conversando acerca de quiénes fueron cuando eran adolescentes y siguen juzgando a las personas como si todas de pronto regresionaran a cuando eran adolescentes, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, además, el libro creo que explora otro tipo de cicatriz, y es la de la narradora que de pronto tiene que acoger a su padre, y es una narradora adulta, 30 y tantos años, y su padre pues ha perdido su dinero en una deuda, qué sé yo, y tiene que acogerlo en su casa, ¿no? Y tiene una relación conflictiva con su padre que se va desarrollando a partir de que viven en el mismo lugar, ¿no? Y otra cosa ahí tiene que ver también con el hecho de que, claro, cuando uno se reencuentra con estos amigos de la infancia cuando es adulto, vuelve a ocupar ese espacio que dejó y todo se vuelve como un gran teatro, ¿no? Entonces, lo que se comparte allí es lo opuesto a la sinceridad, es básicamente volver al lugar en el que estábamos, ¿no? Entonces, lo que a mí me llevó a pensar en escribir esa novela de esta forma también tiene que ver con que la novela está construida en dos momentos. El grupo de amigas cuando son adolescentes, que tienen pequeños conflictos adolescentes, y ya el grupo de amigas en el presente de la novela cuando ya tienen 30 y tantos, ¿no? ¿Y eso por qué? Porque yo creo que después de los 30 y tantos llega un momento que es una suerte de segunda adolescencia, donde al menos en mi generación uno llega a los 30 y tantos diciendo, bueno, soy adulto y no entiende nada de lo que está sucediendo. Entonces eso es un poco lo que les pasa a las amigas, que es ese mismo quiebre que pasa cuando uno es adolescente y pasa ya a ser adulto, pero acá es ya ser un adulto y asumir todas las responsabilidades y lo que conlleva la adultez, ¿no? Y la herida, pues, de la narradora o la cicatriz, que tiene que ver no solo con los vínculos de las amigas que están por ahí, es el que digo, ¿no? Que tiene que recibir a su padre en casa y además, por estas cosas de la tecnología, tiene la casa llena de cámaras por seguridad y un día, mirando las cámaras de seguridad, se da cuenta que su padre le miente, ¿no? Entonces, ahí yo quería jugar también con esta idea de las cámaras trampa, que no sé si han visto, que le colocan a los animales, para nosotros poder ver cómo se comportan los animales cuando ellos no saben que los estamos mirando, ¿no? Entonces era un poco jugar con eso, ¿no? Con el hecho de que en las relaciones humanas hay mucho de apariencia y uno se va reconstruyendo siempre en función del otro. Casi que uno es otro en función de la persona con la que está, ¿no? Entonces, eso creo que me dio por las ramas, pero...
No, creo que eso también, pero no, tiene que ver con el título también de la novela, ¿verdad? Vida animal. O sea, esta cámara trampa, creo que te escuché en otra entrevista decir que hay un vínculo, ¿no? Entre la idea de la cámara trampa y el título de la novela, Vida animal.
Sí, claro, es que las cámaras trampas son puestas para poder vigilar a los animales, pero para también poder cuidarlos, a las especies en extinción y tal, ¿no? Y eso es un poco lo que le pasa al personaje con su padre, ¿no? Tiene un conflicto ahí, pero va por ahí. Y también las amistades también funcionan como la vida animal, ¿no? Como una manada. ¿Y qué pasa si uno de los personajes sale del grupo y tal?
Y aparecen muchos animales también en el libro, el gato muerto, un montón, mucho. Hay como un tipo de simbolismo en el libro sobre la vida animal, ¿no? Como bien dice el título. Ese simbolismo que realmente tiene que ver con los roles sociales que juegan, los papeles, ¿no? Que juegan estas chicas en la amistad, ¿no? Dentro de su manada, como bien dices.
Sí, tal cual. La novela está llena de referencias animales porque quería poner justo esas referencias en momentos cruciales cuando va a pasar algo dentro de la trama, ¿no? Y también cómo los animales pues se van adaptando de acuerdo a las situaciones y van cambiando también muchas cosas, ¿no? Hay N casos donde los animales tienen que incluso, pues, cambia el hábitat justamente por el calentamiento global y ellos cambian, ¿no? Y eso es un poco lo que pasa con las personas, ¿no? Y en la novela lo que sucede es que las amigas llegan a un punto en el que ya se conocen muy poco entre sí, ¿no? Y esta reunión al final termina siendo un poco más reveladora de lo que quería.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Scars then remind us of also what we've endured, of survival, and have you, no pressure at all if you don't, but I'm curious to know, have any of you any new themes or stories that you're thinking of drawing on or exploring next?
I'm profoundly private about work I'm working on. I'm working. Zip.
Fair enough.
Sí, yo diría también estoy en un nuevo proyecto de una novela. No sé bien hacia dónde va, pero a algún lugar llegará.
Yo tengo un libro que va a salir el año que viene, en mayo, se llama Corazón Migrante. Sigo escribiendo sobre la migración, pero ahora estoy escribiendo un poco más sobre cómo mi experiencia con la migración de niña me ha impactado ahora de adulta, cómo impacta mi escritura, cómo impacta mi relación con mis hijos, ¿no? Porque mis hijos han vivido una vida completamente diferente a la mía. Y entonces escribo sobre ese conflicto de cómo yo estoy tratando de no pasarle mis traumas y dramas a mis hijos, pero pues es difícil romper esos ciclos. Entonces ese es un libro que va a salir en mayo del año que viene. Corazón Migrante se llama.
Pues ya tengo ganas de leérmelo. Enhorabuena por eso. Creo que a mí me encantaría quedar aquí hablando y yo tengo un montón de preguntas más, pero se nos escapa el tiempo. Así que tenemos un poquito de tiempo para algunas preguntas, quizás 2 o 3 preguntas.
RTE, supporting the arts.